The moment the black SUVs turned onto my street, I was standing on my front porch in a house dress I had owned for 9 years, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, watching my neighbor's dog dig up the same patch of brown grass it dug up every single morning. It was 7:15 on a Tuesday in February, which is the kind of morning that has no ambitions for itself, the kind of morning that exists simply to be gotten through. And then the first SUV appeared at the end of Carver Street, and I thought, they are lost. People with cars like that are always lost on Carver Street because there is nothing on Carver Street that people with cars like that are ever looking for. And then the second one appeared behind it, and the third. And all three of them slowed down in front of my house, and the doors opened, and men in dark suits stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk that the city had been promising to repair for 6 years. And one of them looked at his phone and then looked at my house and then looked at me on the porch and said, "Is this the residence of Margaret Elaine Cole?" I said, "That depends on who is asking." He said, "Ma'am, we are with Whitmore Group. Mr. Daniel Whitmore sent us." I stood there with my cold coffee and my 9-year-old house dress, and I felt the world tilt very slightly on its axis. The way it tilts when something you had filed away as finished turns out to have been only paused. Daniel. I had not said that name out loud in 3 weeks. I had said it inside my head many times, in the way you rehearse conversations you are never going to have, arguments you will never make, questions you will never ask. But I had not said it out loud, because saying it out loud would have made it real in a way that I was not ready for. And I had been protecting myself from that particular realness with the same careful discipline I applied to everything else in my life that was too large to look at directly. I want to tell you what happened from the beginning, because you cannot understand what those SUVs meant without understanding what came before them. And what came before them was the kind of story that looks like nothing from the outside, but that contains, if you look at it closely enough, everything that matters about the way human beings find each other in the dark. My name is Margaret Elaine Cole. Everyone who knows me calls me Maggie, except my late mother, who called me Elaine when she was proud of me and Margaret when she was not, and my son Marcus, who calls me Mom with an inflection that changes meaning depending on what he needs. I am 53 years old. I live on Carver Street in a small city in North Carolina that you would not recognize by name unless you were from here or had a reason to pass through it, which most people do not. I have lived in the same house on Carver Street for 22 years, which means I have lived in this house longer than my marriage lasted, longer than my son has been alive, longer than most of the things I thought were permanent when I moved in. The house is 900 square feet, with a porch that lists slightly to the left, and a furnace that makes a sound in November like a large animal settling down to sleep, and a kitchen where the window above the sink looks out at a backyard that I have been cultivating for 15 years into something that is genuinely beautiful, which I consider one of my life's real accomplishments, even though no one has ever given me an award for it. I worked until recently, as a dietary aide at Pinehurst Regional Medical Center, which is a 40-minute bus ride from Carver Street, and which paid me $16.80 an hour for 12 years of service, and which let me go 8 months ago in a round of budget cuts that were described in the internal memo as a strategic realignment of workforce resources, which is the language institutions use when they want to fire people without using the word fire. I have since been doing what I can, which is cleaning houses 3 days a week through a service that takes 30% of what the clients pay and returns to me the remaining 70%, which works out to enough to keep the lights on and the refrigerator running and Marcus in the community college program he started in September, if I am very careful and the furnace does not have any ideas about requiring professional attention. I tell you this so you know who I was before Daniel arrived at my door. I was a woman of 53 with a listing porch and a beautiful backyard, and a son in community college, and a budget that required careful management, and a life that was, by every conventional measure, modest. I was not a woman who was waiting for something. I had stopped waiting for things a long time ago, around the time my husband Gerald left for a woman in Greensboro who he described as his soulmate, with the conviction of a man who has never examined the concept carefully. I had stopped waiting and started doing, which is a different thing entirely and which suits me better, because doing gives you something to put your hands on. Now let me tell you about the night Daniel Whitmore came to my door, because everything starts there. It was a Sunday in January, the kind of cold that is not dramatic but is simply insistent, the kind that gets into the house through the window frames and the space under the back door, and sits there at the floor level making your feet cold, no matter what socks you are wearing. I had been in bed reading since 9 o'clock, which is what I do on Sunday nights when Marcus is at his father's and the house is quiet, and I do not have to be anything for anyone for a few hours. It was 11:40 when I heard the knock. I want to be honest with you about my first feeling when I heard a knock at my door at 11:40 on a Sunday night in January, because I think honesty requires acknowledging that my first feeling was not compassion. My first feeling was the particular wariness of a woman living alone on a street where things occasionally happen that she would prefer not to be involved in. I lay still for a moment and waited to see if the knock would repeat, which it did, 3 times, quiet and deliberate, and with a rhythm that did not sound urgent so much as determined. I got up. I put on my robe. I went to the front door and I looked through the peephole, and what I saw was a man. He was standing on my porch with both hands visible at his sides, which I noted because it is one of the things you learn to note when you live alone. He was tall. I could tell that even through the fish-eye lens of the peephole. He was wearing a coat that had once been good quality, but that was now soaked through and plastered against him, and his hair was wet, and he was shaking with the particular whole-body shaking of someone who has been cold for too long. His face, what I could see of it through the peephole, had the gray-white quality of a person whose body is diverting all available resources to keeping the core warm, which is the color of someone who is in real trouble. I opened the door. I do not want to make this sound more heroic than it was. I opened the door because he was shaking and it was cold, and because my mother's voice, which has been living in my head for the 11 years since she died, Said the thing it always says when I am deciding whether to do something that costs me something, which is, Elaine, what kind of person do you want to be in this particular moment? The man on my porch looked at me. His eyes were dark and exhausted, and there was a cut above his left eyebrow that had dried, but that had clearly bled recently. He said, "I am very sorry to bother you. My car went off the road about a mile back. My phone is dead. I have been walking and I think I need to sit down somewhere warm before I try anything else." I stood back from the door. I said, "Come in." He came in. He was dripping on my entry floor, which has linoleum that I replaced myself 4 years ago with the help of 3 YouTube tutorials and a level of determination that surprised even me. I told him to stay on the linoleum while I got towels, which he did, standing there shaking and looking at the walls of my entry hall with an expression that I could not read clearly in the low light. I brought towels, and I brought the spare blanket from the closet shelf, and I brought him to the kitchen because the kitchen was the warmest room. The furnace vent pointed directly at the kitchen table, which I had arranged deliberately years ago because it is where I have my morning coffee, and I like to be warm for that. I sat him down at the kitchen table, and I made tea because tea was what my mother made in every situation, and the habit had transferred to me completely without my permission. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way people do when they are cold all the way through and need the warmth to travel up through their palms and into their arms. He was still shaking, but less violently. In the kitchen light, I could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 50, maybe a few years on either side of that. He had the kind of face that has been handsome and is now something more interesting than handsome, the kind that has been marked by time in ways that add rather than subtract. The cut above his eyebrow was small but deep, and I got the first aid kit from under the sink and cleaned it without asking whether I could, because it needed to be done and he seemed too exhausted to object. He said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm Daniel." I said, "Maggie. Do you want me to call someone for you?" He said, "I don't." He stopped. He said, "Not tonight. There is no one I want to call tonight." I heard something in the way he said that, a particular weight on the word tonight that suggested that the difficulty of calling someone was not a practical problem, but something else, something internal. And I did not press on it because I have been around enough people in enough difficult moments to know that pressing on those particular silences is rarely the right instinct. I said, "You can sleep on the couch tonight. In the morning, we can figure out the car." He looked at me. His expression was complicated. He said, "You don't know me." I said, "I know you're cold and you've got a cut on your head and it's almost midnight. The rest we can sort out tomorrow." He slept on my couch. I know this because I heard him settle after I had gone back to bed, heard the particular quality of silence that means someone in the next room has finally let themselves be still. And I lay in my bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about my mother's question and thought about the kind of person I wanted to be in this particular moment and felt, with the certainty that comes sometimes from doing the simple right thing, that I had answered it correctly. In the morning, I made breakfast. This is important. I want you to understand this about me. I make breakfast the same way every morning regardless of what is happening, because the making of breakfast is the thing that orients me to the day. The ritual that says here is where you are, And this is how the day begins. And it does not matter if there is a stranger sleeping on my couch or a stack of bills on the counter that I do not yet know how to address. Breakfast happens. Eggs scrambled with the peppers from last summer's garden that I freeze in August, toast, orange juice. I made it for two because there was someone in my house, and I was raised in a household where the presence of another person at mealtimes was reason enough to set another place. He woke up when the coffee started. I heard him come to the kitchen doorway, and he stood there for a moment, and I said, "Sit down," and he sat down, and I put the plate in front of him, and he looked at it for a moment with an expression that I can only describe as the expression of someone receiving something they had forgotten they were allowed to receive. He said, "When was the last time someone made you breakfast?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I genuinely don't remember. We ate." He was quiet in the comfortable way, not the uncomfortable way, which is a distinction that matters to me because I can tell the difference. He looked around my kitchen with the particular attention of someone who is seeing a place as it actually is rather than as a category of place. He looked at the window above the sink and the garden outside and the jars of preserved tomatoes on the shelf and the photographs on the refrigerator, Marcus at various ages, my mother in her garden, my friend Bernadette's granddaughter at her first birthday. He looked at all of it the way you look at things when you are absorbing them rather than simply registering them. He said, "That's your garden?" I said, 15 years of work. He said, "It's extraordinary." I said, "It keeps me honest." He looked at me when I said that quickly, with the attention of someone who has heard something they were not expecting. He said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "A garden doesn't let you pretend. You either watered it or you didn't. You either pulled the weeds or you let them take over. It's very clear about what's true." He said, "I have spent a considerable amount of my life in environments where it is not at all clear what's true." I said, "I imagine that gets exhausting." He said, "You have no idea." After breakfast, he called a tow service from my phone. He did not call anyone else. I noted this without commenting on it. The tow service said they would be there in 2 hours because of the road conditions. There had been more ice overnight, and so Daniel sat in my kitchen for 2 more hours and we talked. Not about anything particular. About the garden and about Marcus, and about the medical center job, and about North Carolina winters, and about the book I had been reading when he knocked, which was a history of women who had built things with their own hands across several centuries. A subject I had become interested in without being entirely able to explain why. He listened the way that people who are genuinely intelligent listen, with the quality of attention that makes you feel that every word is being actually received rather than simply waited out. He did not tell me what he did. He did not tell me anything about his life before my porch. And I did not ask, which is perhaps unusual but which felt correct, because there was something in him that was resting, genuinely resting in a way that I suspected he did not often rest, and asking him to account for himself would have interrupted that rest, and I did not want to interrupt it. When the tow truck called to say they were at the car, he stood up from the table and he said, "Margaret." I said, "Maggie." He said, "Maggie, I don't know how to thank you for this." I said, "You don't have to. It was a cold night and you needed somewhere warm." He said, "Most people would not have opened the door." I said, "Most people are afraid of the wrong things." He looked at me again with that quick, particular attention. He said, "Can I come back?" Not to impose, he stopped. He said, "I would like to see the garden. In the spring, if that would be all right." I looked at him standing in my kitchen in the morning light with the 2-day stubble and the bandaged cut above his eyebrow and the coat that was now dry but showed the evidence of the previous night in its creases. I said, "The garden is at its best in May. You're welcome in May." He nodded. He went to the door. He turned back once and said, "You're the first genuinely kind person I have encountered in a very long time. I want you to know I understand that that is a significant thing." He left. The tow truck took his car. I washed the dishes and made the bed on the couch back into a couch and went about my day, which included 2 hours of cleaning a house on the north side of town, whose owner had not noticed that the baseboards needed attention, and which I addressed without being asked, because I am the kind of person who addresses things that need addressing whether or not they are specifically in my job description. I thought about Daniel on the bus home. I thought about the way he had said there is no one I want to call tonight with the weight on tonight. I thought about the expression on his face when I put the plate in front of him, the expression of someone receiving something they had forgot they were allowed to receive. I thought about what kind of person arrives at that condition, at 50 or so, with a good coat and an obvious education, and whatever resources allow a person to be driving on back roads in North Carolina in January. I thought about these things and I did not arrive at any conclusions, which was fine, because not every thought requires a conclusion. He came back in February, not May. I want to tell you that honestly because I think it matters that he did not wait. He knocked on a Saturday afternoon, which is different from a Sunday night in January in every practical way. And when I opened the door, he was standing on the porch in a different coat, a better one, and he was carrying 2 bags of groceries. He said, "I hope this is all right." I found myself in the area and I thought he paused. He said, "I thought I would like to cook you dinner if you would let me, because it occurred to me that you fed me and I have not returned that in any form." I stood back from the door and said, "Come in." He could cook. I want to note this because it surprised me. Not the fact of it, but the quality of it. The particular ease of a person who has cooked seriously for a long time and who moves in a kitchen with the same confidence I move in my garden, knowing where things are without looking, understanding the relationship between elements before they come together. He made something with the groceries he had brought, chicken and lemons and garlic and herbs that I recognized from my own garden dried and hanging on the kitchen wall. And while he cooked, he talked, and I sat at the kitchen table and listened. He talked about things. Not himself, exactly, not his history or his work or his life in the way that people usually account for themselves. He talked about ideas. He talked about the difference between efficiency and wisdom in how institutions make decisions, which I found interesting because it connected to things I had seen at the medical center during 12 years of watching decisions get made. He talked about what makes a city work and what makes it fail, and I talked back, because I had opinions on this from the perspective of Carver Street, which has been failing by certain measures, for as long as I have lived on it while also being, by other measures that do not appear in any city report, full of a particular kind of life and resilience that the city planners seem unable to account for. He listened to what I said with genuine attention and pushed back on some of it and agreed with some of it, and modified his own position when I gave him a reason to, which is rare enough in a man of any age that I noticed it. After dinner, he washed the dishes, which I did not ask him to do. He washed them with the thoroughness of someone who has either been trained well or who finds the act of washing dishes centering in the way that certain repetitive, careful tasks are centering. I dried them and put them away, and the kitchen felt different with two people in it, fuller in a way that I had not noticed my kitchen had become empty until the fullness returned. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. This is the part of the story that I need to tell you carefully, because it would be easy to tell it as a romance, and it was not exactly that, or not only that, or not yet that. And I think the truth of what it was is more interesting and more important than the simpler version. What it was a friendship. A genuine one, the kind that builds slowly through the accumulation of Saturday afternoons and shared dinners and conversations that go past 9 o'clock and end only because one of us has somewhere to be the next morning. He came every Saturday for 6 weeks. He met Marcus, who was home for a weekend in late February, and Marcus looked at him with the particular assessment that young men reserve for men who appear in their mothers' lives. A look that contains both protectiveness and a kind of desperate hope that the man will turn out to be worth the protectiveness. Daniel talked to Marcus about the community college program and about what Marcus wanted to do after, and listened with genuine interest to Marcus's answer, which was that he wanted to work in urban planning, that he had grown up watching Carver Street and streets like it be neglected by the systems designed to serve them, and he wanted to understand those systems from the inside. Daniel said, "That is exactly the right instinct." Then he said, "May I ask who you are studying under?" And Marcus named a professor, and Daniel's expression shifted in a way I noted but could not interpret. He did not tell me what he did. 6 Saturdays, and he had not told me. I had developed theories, based on the coat and the car and the quality of his attention and the particular way he talked about cities and institutions. But I had not asked, and he had not offered, and I had begun to understand that the not telling was itself something, that the Saturdays on Carver Street were something separate for him from whatever he was the rest of the week, and that my kitchen and my garden and my company represented a kind of permission to be just a person in a way that he apparently did not have easy access to in his regular life. I found out on a Tuesday morning when my neighbor Brenda, who works at the public library and therefore has access to information that the rest of us acquire only accidentally, knocked on my door before 8 o'clock with her phone held out in front of her like a document of evidence. On the screen was a photograph and a headline from the business section of the state newspaper. The headline said, "WHITMORE Group announces major redevelopment initiative for distressed urban corridors." The photograph showed a man in a very good suit standing at a podium, and the man in the very good suit was Daniel. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I looked at the headline. I looked at the words Whitmore Group, and I thought about the way he had talked about cities and institutions and the difference between efficiency and wisdom. I thought about the expression on his face when I put the plate in front of him. I thought about 6 Saturdays in my kitchen and 2 bags of groceries, and the way he washed dishes with the thoroughness of someone who finds it centering. Brenda said, "Maggie, that's the man who has been coming to your house." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you know who that is?" I said, "His name is Daniel." She said, "His name is Daniel Whitmore, and he is worth approximately $4 billion. I sat down in my porch chair. I looked at Brenda's phone. I looked at the photograph of the man at the podium who was also the man who had stood shaking on my porch at 11:40 on a Sunday night in January asking if he could sit somewhere warm. I said, "Well." Brenda said, "Well, Maggie, that is all you have to say." I said, "I need to think." I thought for 3 days. I thought about honesty and about what it means when a person does not tell you something significant about themselves across 6 weeks of Saturday afternoons. I thought about whether the not telling was deception or was privacy, and what the difference between those things was, and whether the difference mattered in this particular case. I thought about the cut above his eyebrow and the dead phone, and the way he said there is no one I want to call tonight. I thought about $4 billion and what a person with $4 billion is doing on the back roads of North Carolina in January with a dead phone and a reluctance to call anyone. I thought about all of this, and I arrived, slowly and carefully, at the decision that I needed to ask him about it directly, and that his answer would determine what happened next. He came on Saturday. He knocked at 2 o'clock the way he always knocked, 3 times, deliberate and quiet. I opened the door and let him in, and I said, "Sit down at the table, please," and he looked at my face and sat down at the table without asking why. I put a copy of the newspaper article on the table between us. I sat across from him. I said, "I need you to tell me why you didn't." He looked at the article. He looked at me. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that is not evasion but preparation, the gathering of words for something that requires care. Then he said, because for the first time in a very long time I was in a place where someone was responding to me and not to what I represent. He said, "When you opened the door that night, you did not know anything about me. You made me tea and you cleaned a cut on my head and you made up the couch, and in the morning you made breakfast and you sat across from me and talked to me like I was a person who was worth talking to. Not an asset, not a liability, not a news story, just a person." He said I was not ready to give that up. I said, "And now?" He said, "I was always going to tell you. I was trying to find the right moment, and I kept finding reasons why the moment I was in was too good to interrupt." I looked at him. I said, "Daniel, what were you doing on that road in January?" He was quiet again. Then he said, "I had driven away from a situation that I did not know how to be in anymore. My company was in the middle of a very significant transaction, and there were people in my life, people I had trusted, who I had discovered were operating in ways that were not consistent with the values I believed the company to hold. I had gotten in my car and driven without a destination because I needed to be in motion without being reachable. and I had gone further than I intended, and the roads were worse than I expected, and the car went off the road. I said the people who were not operating consistently with your values. What happened to them? He said, I went back and I dealt with it. It took 3 weeks, and it was the hardest professional thing I have done in 20 years. But I dealt with it. I said, and the company, he said, the company is all right. Better than all right. I looked at him across my kitchen table. I looked at the newspaper article between us. I thought about my mother's question. What kind of person do you want to be in this particular moment? And I thought about what kind of person had been sitting at my table for 6 Saturdays. And I thought about the difference between a man who has $4 billion and a man who washes dishes with the thoroughness of someone who finds it centering. And I thought about whether those two things were contradictory or whether they were simply two true things about the same complicated person. I said, I wish you had told me sooner. He said, I know, I'm sorry. I said, I need you to be honest with me going forward, about everything. I am not a complicated person in the sense of requiring elaborate things, but I require honesty the way I require water. It is not optional. He said, I understand. I said, good. Do you want to stay for dinner? He stayed for dinner. He stayed until 10 o'clock. When he left, he stood on the porch for a moment and he said, Maggie, can I ask you something? I said, yes. He said, did it change anything? Knowing, I thought about this honestly, which is the only way I know how to think about things. I said, it changes the shape of some things. It doesn't change what I know about who you are in this kitchen on a Saturday afternoon. Those are two different kinds of knowing, and both of them are true. He said, I have not encountered many people in my life who can hold two true things at the same time without needing to choose between them. I said, it's a skill. You develop it when your life requires it. He left. I washed the dinner dishes and dried them and put them away and thought about what my life had become in the 7 weeks since a cold man had knocked on my door at 11:40 on a Sunday night. I thought about it with the particular careful attention I give to things that matter, turning it over slowly, examining each side, looking for the places where it was solid, and the places where it was uncertain, and the places where it required more information before I could know what it was. I was still thinking about it when Brenda knocked on my door the following Tuesday with her phone held out again. And this time, the photograph showed Daniel at another podium, and the headline said, WHITMORE Group, NAMES Carver Street Corridor, as first site in new urban revitalization initiative. I read the article 3 times. I sat on my porch with Brenda's phone, and I read it 3 times because the first time I did not fully absorb what it said, and the second time I absorbed it, but did not believe it, and the third time I believed it, but did not yet understand what to do with believing it. The article said that Whitmore Group had selected a 2-mile corridor in our city as the inaugural site for a new development initiative that was described as community-centered rather than displacement-centered. That would involve rehabilitation of existing housing stock rather than demolition. That would fund local businesses and local hiring and local schools as part of the development package. And that had been designed, the article said, after extensive consultation with community members about what the community actually needed rather than what outside developers typically assumed it needed. Carver Street was mentioned by name. The cracked sidewalk that the city had promised to repair for 6 years was mentioned by name. The medical center, which was described as a critical community health asset that the initiative intended to support rather than compete with, was mentioned by name. And at the bottom of the article, in a section about the initiative's community partnership structure, there was a quote from Daniel Whitmore that said, "The work of understanding a community begins with the experience of sitting in it, not flying over it or studying it from a distance." We have tried to design this initiative from the ground up, which means starting from the ground. I sat on my porch and I held Brenda's phone and I thought about 6 Saturdays in my kitchen and conversations about cities and what makes them work and what makes them fail. And I thought about Marcus talking about urban planning and wanting to understand the systems from the inside. And I thought about Daniel's expression when Marcus said that, the shift that I had noted and not interpreted. And I began to understand something about those 6 Saturdays that I had understood only partially before, which is that the listening had not been only the listening of a person resting and being replenished, though it had been that too. It had also been the listening of someone who was trying to understand something real about a place from someone who knew it from the inside, and who had had the honesty, at least, to bring groceries and cook dinner rather than simply asking questions. I did not know what to do with this understanding. I sat with it for a day and a half and then I called Daniel, which I had not done before. I had always waited for him to call or to arrive, and the fact of my calling was itself a statement that I made deliberately. He answered on the second ring. He said, "Maggie." I said, "I read the article about Carver Street." He was quiet. I said, "I need to know something. The 6 Saturdays, were they research?" He said no. He said it without hesitation and with a force that I believed. He said, "Maggie, they were never research. What I learned from you about this neighborhood informed decisions I was already making because you talked about real things and I listened because real things are useful and because I respect you enough to use what you teach me. But the Saturdays were not research. The Saturdays were the most real thing I have had in my life in longer than I can account for." I said, "I need to believe that." He said, "I know." "I hope I have given you reason to." I said, "The initiative, Carver Street. Will it actually do what the article says?" He said, "That is my intention and my commitment. But I would like to talk to you about it directly before it goes further, because you know things about this street that no document I have been given reflects, and I don't want to get it wrong." I said, "Come on Saturday." He came on Saturday. And this Saturday was different from the others because Marcus was home and Bernadette was there and my neighbor Clarence, who has lived on Carver Street for 31 years and who has watched every previous development initiative arrive with promises and leave with displacement, was there too. I had invited them without telling Daniel I was going to, and when he arrived at 2 o'clock and found 4 people at my kitchen table instead of 1, he paused in the doorway for a moment, and then he came in and sat down, and he did not seem alarmed. He seemed, if I read his face correctly, something closer to relieved. He talked to them. He answered every question, including the hard ones that Clarence asked with the directness of a man who has been lied to by institutions for 3 decades and has run out of patience for soft answers. What happens to the people who rent here when the property values go up? Who makes the decisions about what gets built? Where does the money for local hiring actually come from, and who controls it? Daniel answered each question specifically and without the kind of language that institutions use when they want to appear transparent while actually obscuring things. He was direct. He acknowledged where the plan had weaknesses. He asked Clarence questions in return, genuine questions, and wrote things down in a notebook he took from his coat pocket. And I watched Clarence watch him write things down and saw something shift in Clarence's face. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the first consideration of the possibility of trust. After 2 hours, Marcus said, "Can I ask you something personal?" Daniel said, "Yes." Marcus said, "Why Carver Street? There are corridors like this in every city. Why this one?" Daniel looked at me briefly and then back at Marcus. He said, "Because someone who lives here taught me that places like this contain things that are worth preserving along with what needs to be improved, and that the difference between development that helps and development that harms is almost entirely about whether the people doing it bother to learn the difference before they start." He said, "I happened to meet someone who was willing to teach me." Marcus looked at his mother. I kept my face composed. After everyone left Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the coffee and the evening coming in through the window. He said, "Was that a test?" I said, "It was a conversation. I needed the people I trusted to be in the room with you." He said, "And?" I said, "Clarence is still not sure. Bernadette thinks you are genuine. Marcus is watching." He said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think you are a complicated person who has done something real here, and I am choosing to believe the real part is the part that matters most." He said, "That is the most I have hoped for." Now, I need to tell you about the morning the SUVs came, because I started there, and I need to take you back to close the circle. And because what happened after the SUVs is the part of the story that changed everything in ways I had not anticipated, even in the careful, methodical way I anticipate things. The men in the dark suits were not there for trouble. They were there because Daniel had sent them with a letter and a package, because Daniel himself was in meetings in New York that he could not leave, and he had wanted to send something before a particular deadline, and he had not wanted to send it impersonally. The lead man handed me a sealed envelope and a flat box and said, "Mr. Whitmore asked me to wait for a response if you have one." I took them inside. In the envelope was a letter in Daniel's handwriting, which I recognized from the notes he had made in his notebook the Saturday Clarence was there. The letter was 3 pages long. The first page was an account of what the Whitmore Group initiative on Carver Street had accomplished in the 3 months since it had been formally announced, which was more than I had realized. The sidewalk repair had been funded. The Community Planning Board had been constituted with 4 Carver Street residents, including Clarence. The local hiring protocols had been written into the contract in language that Clarence's cousin, who was a lawyer, had reviewed and approved. The second page was a description of a new position that the Whitmore Group was creating, a director of community integration, whose job was to be the living connection between the initiative and the community it was serving, to be the person who stayed when the project managers moved on, who knew the names of the people on the street and remembered what they needed before they had to ask. The third page said, Maggie, I am asking if you will take this position. Not because I am trying to find a way to keep you in my life, though I want that too, and I will not pretend otherwise. Because you are the right person for this work in a way that I cannot adequately express except to say that everything about how this initiative was designed started from what you showed me about this street and the people who live on it. The salary is in the box. Please open the box before you decide. I open the box. I will not tell you the number because it is not the point. The point is that it was more than I had made in any previous year of my life, more than the medical center and the house cleaning combined. Enough for Marcus's school to be cert and the furnace to be attended to and the porch to be repaired without a calculation being required. Enough to make the thing I had been doing carefully and with great effort into a thing I could do with margin, which changes not what you do, but how you do it in ways that anyone who has lived without margin understands immediately. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in one hand and the box in the other, and I thought about my mother's question. What kind of person do you want to be in this particular moment? And I thought about 11:40 on a Sunday night in January and towels and tea and a couch made up in the dark. I thought about 15 years of garden and 12 years of medical center and 9 years of house dress and a listing porch and a furnace that sounded like a large animal settling down to sleep. I thought about what it had cost me to open the door and what it had returned to me, and I thought about the difference between a coincidence and a consequence, and whether what had happened on my porch was one of those things or the other. I wrote a response on the back of the third page of Daniel's letter because I did not have better stationery. I wrote, yes, but I have conditions. Come on Saturday and I'll tell you what they are. And then I wrote, also the sidewalk looks better. Then I folded it and gave it to the man in the dark suit who was waiting on my porch, and he took it with the careful gravity of someone who has been entrusted with important things and who understands that importance is not always determined by appearance. He left. The 3 SUVs pulled away from Carver Street in a line, past the neighbors who had come to their windows to watch, past Clarence who was standing on his porch with a coffee cup and an expression that contained both suspicion and something that was beginning to look like its opposite. I watched them go. I went inside. I put the kettle on because it was still morning and the morning required coffee. I want to tell you what the conditions were, because they matter to this story in the way that the specific terms of a thing always matter, because the terms are where the real values live. The conditions were 3. First, that Marcus be offered a summer internship with the planning team, not as a favor to me, but as a genuine opportunity that he would have to earn by being good at it, which I knew he would be. Second, that Clarence be given a formal seat on the Community Advisory Board with actual decision-making authority and not merely the appearance of it, which I knew from 12 years at the medical center was the difference between participation and performance. Third, that the Director of Community Integration position, which would be mine, would have a specific and enforceable mandate that could not be overridden by outside project managers without a community board vote, because I had seen too many well-intentioned positions become decorative over time when the people in them had no actual authority. Daniel accepted all three conditions without negotiation. He accepted them on Saturday, sitting at my kitchen table, and he said, "These are the right conditions and I should have built them into the original offer." I said, "You would have gotten there." He said, "I got there faster because of you." I said, "That is what this is supposed to work like." I have been in the Director of Community Integration position for 4 months now. I want to tell you what the work actually looks like, because I think it is important for you to hear it described honestly rather than in the language that appears in press releases, which is a language I have been required to learn and which I use when I must and set aside when I can. The work looks like this. I am on Carver Street every day. I know which houses have deferred maintenance that the city's housing rehabilitation grant can address, and which families are uncertain about whether to participate because they have been burned by previous initiatives and need more than a brochure to trust this one. I know that Clarence's neighbor Vera has a daughter who is a licensed electrician who has been doing residential work for 10 years and who has been excluded from the kinds of contracts that this initiative is generating. And I have been spending considerable energy on the specific bureaucratic problem of getting her credentials recognized in the city's contractor registry, which is a problem that should not exist, but does, and which I am not finished with. I know that the elementary school 3 blocks from my house needs a reading specialist more than it needs anything the facilities budget can provide. And I am in conversation with the foundation arm of Whitmore Group about a partnership that would address this, which is a conversation that requires me to be fluent in the language of grant structures and educational outcomes, while simultaneously remembering that what we are actually talking about is children learning to read. I hold both of those things at the same time, which is a skill, as I told Daniel, that you develop when your life requires it. Marcus did the internship. He was good at it, which I say not as his mother, or not only as his mother, but as someone who watched him in meetings with engineers and planners and community members, and saw him do the thing that Daniel had identified in him that Saturday, which is the thing of understanding systems from the inside while keeping hold of what the systems are supposed to be for. The planning supervisor told me in August that Marcus was among the most practically insightful interns he had worked with in 15 years, and asked whether Marcus would consider a full position after graduation. I gave him Marcus's phone number and stayed out of it. Clarence. I need to tell you about Clarence because he is the part of this story that I am most proud of, which means he is the part I want to tell you most carefully. Clarence has been on the Community Advisory Board for 4 months. He has voted against 2 project proposals that he felt did not adequately protect existing renters. Both times, the project managers appealed to Daniel directly, and both times Daniel upheld the board's decision, which means both times the proposals went back to the drawing board and both times they came back better. Clarence does not trust Daniel yet. He may never fully trust him, which is appropriate and which I respect. But he told me last month, standing on his porch with a coffee cup, that the initiative had done one thing he had not expected it to do, which was to make him feel that his 31 years of knowledge about this street were being treated as information rather than as sentiment. He said they're actually using what I know. That's new. I said it took a while to get here. He said it took somebody opening a door at the wrong time of night. I looked at him. He looked at me. We have been neighbors for 22 years and we do not usually speak in metaphors, but some things earn the departure. Daniel, I should tell you where we are because you are watching this and you deserve the honest account. We are in the particular territory of two people who are learning each other in real time, carefully and with attention, the way you learn a garden, understanding that you cannot rush the seasons and that the thing growing will tell you what it needs if you are paying the right kind of attention. He is on Carver Street most Saturdays. He knows which jar on the shelf is the tomatoes from last August and which is the green beans. He has met my friend Bernadette and has been subjected to her very thorough assessment, from which he emerged with a passing grade and the observation from Bernadette that he is the kind of man who listens to women, which is rarer than it should be. He and Marcus have a text chain that I am not on and which I have not asked to be shown, because Marcus is 20 years old and entitled to his own relationship with the people in his mother's life. I know because Marcus told me in the oblique way he tells me important things, that Daniel has connected him with a professor at a university in Raleigh who is doing work on urban planning that directly relates to what Marcus wants to do, and that this connection happened because Daniel thought Marcus would benefit from it, not because I asked. This is the kind of thing I notice. This is the kind of thing that tells me what I need to know. I want to say something now to the people who are watching this, because I think you are here for a reason, and I think the reason is not only to hear a story, though I hope the story has been worth your time. I think you are here because something in this story connects to something in your own life, something about the cost of kindness and whether it is worth it, something about what happens when you open a door you did not have to open. Here is what I know about opening doors. It costs you something every time. Not always money, not always time, though sometimes those things too. It costs you the protective layer that you build up when you have been living carefully and within your means and managing risk, the way a person has to manage risk when there is no cushion. It costs you the comfortable certainty that not my problem is a complete moral position rather than just a convenient one. It costs you the sleep you would have had if you had not opened the door, and the peace you would have had if you had not made the tea, and the ordinary Saturday you would have had if you had not made a second place at the table. And here is the other side of what I know, the side that is harder to say without sounding like a greeting card, which I am going to say anyway because it is true. The doors that cost you something are the ones that open onto the real world, the world where people are connected to each other in ways that are not transactional and not efficient, and not visible from a spreadsheet or a development proposal or a strategic alignment of workforce resources. The doors that cost you something are the ones where your life gets bigger, not because you got something, but because you gave something, and giving something to another person in a moment of genuine need creates a connection that has weight and that persists, and that changes the shape of both lives in ways that neither of you planned, and that no amount of money, regardless of how many zeros follow the first digit, can fully account for. I am not a woman who believes that everything happens for a reason. I am too acquainted with random suffering and senseless loss to believe that the universe is operating with that level of intention. But I believe in the consequence of choices. I believe that what you choose to do in the small moments, the 11:40 moments, and the cold January moments, and the peephole moments where you are deciding what kind of person you are going to be, accumulates into something real. Not always into something as legible as what happened to me on Carver Street. Not always with a letter and a box and 3 SUVs pulling up to your door, but into something, into the person you are, into the community around you, into the understanding, however small, that the world is slightly more than the sum of its indifferences. My listing porch has been repaired. I want to tell you this because I find it deeply satisfying. It was repaired by a man named Robert who lives 4 blocks from here, and who learned carpentry from his father, and who had not had consistent work in 2 years, and who came to my attention through Vera, the electrician, who knows everyone in this neighborhood who knows how to build and fix things. I paid him fairly, and he did excellent work, and the porch is now level and solid, and I stand on it every morning with my coffee and look at Carver Street and feel something I am going to call, simply, contentment, because it is the right word and it does not require embellishment. The garden is going to be extraordinary this spring. I have been planning it all winter, ordering seeds and amending the soil in November when the last of the season's growth was cleared. And I have a vision for it that is the most ambitious I have had in 15 years of working that ground. Daniel has asked if he can help with the planting in May, and I have said yes, which means that in May, there will be a man who is worth approximately $4 billion on his knees in my backyard in North Carolina getting his good coat dirty, which is either a very funny thing or a very beautiful thing, or both of those simultaneously. Which is, I have learned, the condition that the best things in life almost always inhabit. If you are watching this right now, and you are in the middle of a moment where opening a door seems too costly, where the risk seems too high and the return too uncertain, and the voice of caution is louder than the voice of your own decency, I want to talk to you directly. I want to say that I understand the voice of caution. I have listened to it many times, and many of those times it was correct, and I am still alive and functional partly because I listened to it. But I also want to say that there are moments when caution and cowardice are wearing the same coat, and the difference between them is not visible from the outside. Only you can tell the difference, and you can only tell it by asking my mother's question. What kind of person do you want to be in this particular moment? Not in your life overall, not in the abstract, in this moment. This specific, unrepeatable, already ending moment. That is the only question, and you already know the answer. You have always known it. The knowing is not the hard part. The hard part is trusting what you know enough to act on it in the dark, at 11:40, in a house dress you have owned for 9 years, with cold coffee in your hand and a stranger on your porch who is shaking with cold and asking for somewhere warm to sit. I opened the door. My life got larger. That is the whole of it. Now, before I let you go, I need to tell you 2 things. The first is practical. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, and hit the notification bell. Leave your name and your city in the comments below. Tell me what you would have done at 11:40 with a cold stranger on your porch. Tell me about a door you opened or a door you did not open, and what came from either choice. This channel is a community, and communities are built from honest stories shared between real people, and I want yours. The second thing is a tease, because there is something coming in the next video that I have not told you yet. There is someone else in this story. Someone who was in Daniel's life before Carver Street. Someone who knew what he was worth and treated him accordingly. Who appears in this story after the SUVs, and after the letter, and after the Saturday when Clarence sat at my table. And what this person did when they found out what had happened, and what I said to them in a conversation that lasted 11 minutes in the lobby of a building I had no business being in, is the kind of thing that I think you need to hear. Because it is the part of the story that is about what happens to the people who keep their doors closed and what that costs them, and whether the cost is visible to them even when it becomes very, very large. I will tell you next time. Subscribe, leave your name, tell me where you are watching from. I am Maggie Cole, and I am on Carver Street in North Carolina, and I will see you in the next video. But before next time, let me go back. Let me go back to the part of this story that I moved through quickly, because I was trying to get to the SUVs and the letter, but which deserves more space because the truth of what happened to me in the months between January and February is not fully told yet. And I promised you honesty. And honesty requires the parts that are hard to tell as much as it requires the parts that resolve cleanly. After the first Saturday, after Daniel had cooked dinner and washed the dishes and left at 10 o'clock, and I had stood at the sink drying the last glass and thought about what was happening, I did something I am not proud of. I Googled him. I know. You are thinking, Maggie, that is completely reasonable, and you are correct that it is completely reasonable, and I am not ashamed of the reasonableness of it. What I am slightly ashamed of is what I did after I Googled him and found nothing, which is that I let the finding of nothing make me feel better than it should have. Because finding nothing when you search for a person does not mean the person is simple. It means either that they are private or that they are unknown. And both of those things are different from the absence of complexity. And I let myself use the absence of searchable information as permission to stop wondering, which was a failure of the same clear-eyed attention I pride myself on. I want to tell you about this because I think the people who watch these videos, the people who are building lives carefully and with attention and without excess margin, sometimes have a particular vulnerability that comes directly from their strength. The vulnerability is this: because we have learned to read situations carefully and to trust our instincts, and to make good decisions with limited information, we sometimes mistake the quality of our perception for completeness. We feel that we are seeing something clearly and we stop looking because we trust the clarity, and what we are actually seeing is a true thing that is not the only true thing. Daniel was everything I perceived him to be in that kitchen. Genuine, attentive, honest in the ways that I witnessed him being honest. A person who listened in the real way and who grew tomatoes with me and who came back the second Saturday with groceries instead of excuses. All of that was true. And simultaneously, there was a whole world attached to him that I was not seeing, not because he was hiding it exactly, but because I had stopped looking for it. And those two things were both happening at the same time, and I did not know how to account for them simultaneously until Brenda knocked on my door with her phone. I tell you this because I think it is important for anyone who opens a door to another person to hold onto their capacity for clear sight even while they are being generous. Generosity and discernment are not opposites. They are partners. The best version of an open door is one where you see the person coming through it fully, not softened by hope or sharpened by fear, but as they actually are, which includes the parts you can see and the parts you cannot yet see and the parts they are not yet ready to show you. Holding all of that at the same time, the visible and the invisible and the not yet known, is the work of genuine relationship, and it is harder than either blind trust or reflexive suspicion, and it is the only thing that actually works. I want to talk about what happened with my job, the cleaning job, because I left it when I took the director of community integration position, and the leaving of it was not simple in the way that leaving a job you disliked might be simple. The cleaning job had problems. 30% taken off the top by a service that provided me with no benefits and no job security and no protection, and that could end my assignments at any time for any reason was not a good arrangement. The physical demands of it were real in my body in ways I tried not to dwell on. The particular dynamic of cleaning the houses of people who did not know my name was a dynamic I managed with dignity, but that had a cost. I know all of this. And I also know that the cleaning job was mine. I found it. I applied for it. I showed up for it every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday for 8 months, and I did it well because I do everything well that I commit to doing, and the doing of it was part of how I maintained my sense of myself in a period when a lot of other things that had been part of my sense of myself had been removed. The medical center job had been part of my identity for 12 years, and it had been taken from me in language designed to obscure the fact that it was being taken from me. And the cleaning job was what I had built in the place where that identity had been, and it was modest and it was mine, and leaving it for something larger did not make the leaving simple. I went to see the woman who ran the cleaning service before I formally accepted Daniel's offer. Her name was Patricia, and she had built the service herself over 12 years from the same nothing I was building from, and she was brisk and practical in the way of women who have built things themselves and who do not have patience for ornament. I told her I was leaving and why. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "Good." She said it without any of the complicated feelings that I had expected her to have. She said, You should never have been here in the first place. You know that. I said I needed the work. She said, I know, and you were good at it. But you were always going to be here only for a while, and the while is over. She paused. Then she said, will you do something for me? I said, what? She said, there are 3 women working for me right now who are in the same position you were in 8 months ago. Overqualified and underplaced and making do because making do was what the moment required. If you get to a point in your new position where there is anything, any connection, any opening, anything at all that could help one of them find what you found, I want you to remember them. I said, give me their names. She gave me their names. I have them written in the back of the notebook I keep on my desk at the Beaumont. No wrong story. At the Whitmore Group community office on Carver Street, which is a small room in a building that previously housed a laundromat and that still smells faintly of industrial detergent in a way that I find oddly comforting. I have their names, and I have been thinking about them every week, and I have not yet found the right opening, but I am looking. Because Patricia was right, and because looking is part of what this job is for, and because the point of a door opening is not only what comes through it when it opens. The point is also what it becomes possible to open for someone else. I want to tell you about the call I got from the medical center. This was 2 months after I started the new position, which means it was about 2 months ago from when I am sitting here telling you this story. The call was from the medical center's human resources director, a woman named Sandra who I had known professionally for 12 years and who had called me 3 times after the layoff to express her personal regret in a way that was genuine, but that could not change anything. This call was different. She said that the medical center was in the process of reconstituting its community health outreach program, which had been cut in the same strategic realignment that had cut my position, and that they were looking for a new structure for it. She said that she had heard, through channels she described as informal but reliable, that the Whitmore Group initiative on Carver Street included a community health component, and that she was calling to ask whether there was a possibility of a partnership. I said, tell me what you're thinking. She told me. It was preliminary and uncertain and required a great deal more work before it would be anything real. But the shape of it was this. The medical center had clinical capacity that the Carver Street community could benefit from and was underusing because of access barriers that were fundamentally logistical rather than clinical. The initiative had community trust that the medical center lacked. A partnership that combined those 2 things, brokered by someone who was trusted by both sides, could address a gap that had existed on Carver Street for as long as I had lived here. I said, I will need to bring this to the community board. She said, of course. I said, Clarence needs to be in the first meeting. She said, who is Clarence? I said, the person whose 31 years of knowledge about this street will determine whether this works or whether it becomes another initiative that looked good on paper and failed on the ground. I said, I can set up the meeting for next month if you can commit to bringing decision makers rather than representatives. She said she could commit to that. We are now 3 weeks from that meeting. I have been preparing Clarence for it with the thoroughness of someone who knows that the preparation is as important as the meeting itself, which I know from 12 years of watching clinical outcomes be determined not by the quality of the clinical intervention, but by the quality of the preparation and the relationship and the trust that preceded it. This is the work. This is what the director of community integration position actually is, which is not a title and not a salary and not 3 SUVs on Carver Street. It is this, the careful, persistent, unglamorous labor of building the bridges that institutions are too large and too inertial and too invested in their own procedures to build for themselves, using the knowledge and the relationships and the specific gravity of a person who has been on this street long enough to know which houses have deferred maintenance and which families have been burned, and which 31-year residents hold the knowledge that no document reflects. It is the work of a woman in a 9-year house dress and a listing porch who opened a door at 11:40 and whose life, as a result, became large enough to be useful in ways that she could not have planned. I want to close with Marcus, because this story is also his story, and I do not want to finish without giving him his proper place in it. Marcus is 20 years old, and he is in his 2nd year at community college, and he is going to transfer to a 4-year program in the fall, which I know because the professor in Raleigh that Daniel connected him with has offered him a place in a research project that comes with a scholarship, and which Marcus accepted with the particular mixture of excitement and carefully managed cool that 20-year-olds use to protect themselves from being seen to want something too much. He called me the evening he found out, and his voice had the quality of a person trying to contain something too large for the container, which is one of my favorite sounds in the world, the sound of a life exceeding its own expectations. He said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." I said, "I'm listening." He said, "I used to think the problem with places like Carver Street was that the people who made decisions about them didn't care. But I've been watching you work, and I've been in these meetings, and I've been reading what Dr. Ackhaffer assigns in the research group, and I think the real problem is more specific than that. I think the problem is that caring without knowing is almost as useless as not caring, and most of the people who make decisions about communities like ours care, they genuinely do, but they know almost nothing, and the gap between caring and knowing is where all the damage happens." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Yes. That is exactly right." He said, "And the only way to close the gap is to put the knowing where the deciding is." He said, "That's what you're doing, right? You're the knowing inside the deciding." I said, "I am trying to be." He said, "You've always been that. Just nobody gave you the room for it before." I sat with that for a while after we hung up. I sat with it the way I sit with things that are true and important and that deserve not to be rushed past. My son is 20 years old, and he has figured out something that most people spend their whole careers circling without ever landing on. And he figured it out by watching his mother do her job, which means that the doing of the job is its own kind of teaching, which means that my grandmother was right, and Patricia was right, and my mother was right, and every person who ever told me that the work matters beyond its visible outcomes was right, and I have never been more sure of anything in my life. The garden is waiting for spring. Daniel is coming in May. Clarence has a seat at a table where decisions get made. Marcus has a scholarship. The sidewalk on Carver Street has been repaired. Patricia's 3 women are in my notebook. Sandra from the medical center has a meeting in 3 weeks. And I am standing on a level porch with a cup of coffee that is still hot, because I have learned to drink it before it goes cold, looking at a street that I have lived on for 22 years and that I am now, in ways I did not anticipate and could not have planned, in the middle of helping to change. This is not a fairy tale. The problems on Carver Street are real and deep and will outlast any single initiative. Clarence's skepticism is appropriate, and I share parts of it. There are things about the partnership with the Whitmore Group that I watch carefully and that require my attention to stay honest. Because the difference between development that helps and development that harms is not a fixed thing, it requires constant maintenance. And the maintenance is part of my job, and I take it seriously. The world did not become simple when the SUVs arrived. It became more complex in some ways and more possible in others. And I hold both of those at the same time, which is, as I keep telling you, a skill that you develop when your life requires it. What I want you to take from this story, if you take only one thing, is not that kindness is rewarded, because it is not always rewarded, and building your moral life on the expectation of reward is a foundation that will not hold. What I want you to take is this: the person you become through the practice of opening doors, the specific and real and embodied person that the choices make you, that person is the reward. That person is what you keep. That person goes with you through every strategic realignment of workforce resources and every listing porch and every cold January night. That person is the one who knows how to make a second place at the table because someone is in the house, and it is mealtime, and that is simply what you do. That person is the one who asks what kind of person do you want to be and already knows the answer and acts on it in the dark. That person is you. She was always you. She just needed the right moment to become fully visible. Subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell. Drop your name and your city in the comments below. Tell me about a door you opened. Tell me about a door you almost didn't open. Tell me about the people on your Carver Street and what you see when you look at them and what you wish someone would do and what you are considering doing yourself. I read every word. I am here. My name is Maggie Cole. I live on Carver Street. I opened a door. And I will see you in the next video, where I am going to tell you about the conversation in the lobby that lasted 11 minutes and changed something I did not know needed changing in myself, which is the best kind of change and the hardest kind to tell. Stay close. Let me take you back to the nights. The specific nights of those 8 months between the layoff and the knock on the door. Because I passed through them quickly, and they deserve more than passing through. Because they are the part of the story that belongs to every person watching this, who is in the middle of something hard and cannot yet see the other side. When the medical center let me go, they gave me 3 weeks of severance and a pamphlet about resources for displaced workers that contained a list of phone numbers that connected to menus, that connected to hold music, that eventually connected to people who were doing their best in a system that was designed to process volume rather than to help anyone specifically. I went through the pamphlet. I called the numbers. I sat on hold in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and looked at my garden through the window above the sink and thought about what my grandmother would have done in this situation, which was the thing I always thought about when the situation required more than I currently had. My grandmother was a woman named Dorothy Cole, which was my married name before it was my given name, which is a coincidence that my grandmother would have called a sign, and that I call simply the way things sometimes arrange themselves. Dorothy Cole worked as a domestic for 40 years in a city that has since changed beyond recognition. And she raised 3 children on a domestic's wage with a dignity so complete and so consistent that the dignity itself was the message. The clearest statement she ever made about what she believed about herself and what she intended her children to believe about themselves. She died when I was 19, and I have been drawing on her in the 40 years since in the way that you draw on a deep well, coming back every time things get dry, finding it full every time in a way that I still do not entirely understand, except that some people leave more than they take, and she was one of those people. I thought about Dorothy Cole during the 8 months. I thought about her when I submitted the cleaning service application, and when I cleaned my first house for the first time since Gerald had left, and I had cleaned our own house alone for the first time in 10 years. I thought about her on the bus to the north side of town and on the bus back, sitting with tired feet and the smell of the cleaning products that absorbed into your clothing, no matter how careful you were. I thought about her when Marcus came home one weekend and saw me in the cleaning service polo shirt and had an expression on his face that he was trying to conceal from me, the particular expression of a child who is reckoning with a version of their parent they had not anticipated and who loves that parent too much to let the reckoning show. I said, Marcus. He said, yeah, Mom. I said, this is temporary. He said, I know. I said, I have been temporary before and I always come out the other side. He said, I know that too. I said, good. Now tell me what's happening in the program. He told me about the program. I listened and asked questions and made dinner, and we ate at the kitchen table, and it was a good evening. This is what I want to tell you about those months. The good evenings were still there. The garden was still there. The coffee was still there in the morning, and Brenda's gossip was still there, and Clarence on his porch with his coffee cup was still there. And Dorothy Cole was still in the deep well and still full, and those things did not stop being true because the medical center had strategically realigned its workforce resources. The hardship was real, and I am not telling you to minimize it. The hardship was real, and it was present every day, and it cost me things, sleep and ease, and the particular lightness that comes from not having to calculate. But it was not the whole of my days. I did not let it be the whole of my days, because that is a choice, a genuine choice that requires effort, and I made it because Dorothy Cole made it, and because I am her granddaughter, and because the alternative is a surrender I am not willing to make. I want to talk about what loneliness actually feels like at 53, because I think it is important, and I think it is a thing people do not talk about honestly enough. Not the romantic kind of loneliness, though that exists, and I am not going to pretend it does not. But the specific loneliness of being a person who has been doing things for a very long time, and who is very competent and very capable, and who nonetheless arrives at 53 and looks at the scope of what one person can do alone and understands that scope is not infinite. The loneliness of realizing that the systems you have been operating within, the job and the routines and the structure, were doing more social work than you realized, that they were providing a daily community of the kind that you do not notice until it is gone. The particular silence of a house where a capable woman is managing everything that needs to be managed and doing it well and doing it alone, and coming home to a kitchen where the only sound is the refrigerator. Gerald left when Marcus was 12. Marcus is 20 now, which means I have been alone in this house for 8 years. 8 years during which I have built and maintained the garden and the friendships and the routines and the particular rich interior life that solitary, capable women build for themselves because they know how, because the alternative is an emptiness that requires filling with something worse. 8 years is a long time. You get good at alone. You get so good at it that you sometimes forget that you got good at it out of necessity rather than preference, that the goodness is a skill you developed and not a state you were always in. Daniel, on the first Saturday, sat in my kitchen and talked to me about cities and institutions, and I talked back, and there was something in the quality of the exchange that was different from the exchanges I was used to having. I do not mean better. I mean different in kind. I had Bernadette, and I had Clarence, and I had Brenda, and I had Marcus on the phone every few days, and I had the relationships at the cleaning service, which were collegial in the limited way of people who work alongside each other without long hours in between to develop depth. I had people. But the specific kind of exchange that happened with Daniel in my kitchen, the kind where two people are both contributing and both receiving and both being genuinely encountered rather than simply seen, that kind had been absent for a long time. I had not noticed how absent it was until it was present. I am telling you this because I think it is the honest account of why the Saturdays mattered to me independently of what Daniel turned out to be and what came from knowing him, because the mattering is not fully explained by the outcome. It is not fully explained by the letter or the job or the repaired porch. The mattering was itself, the Saturdays themselves, the recovery of something I had not known I was missing until I had it back, which is one of the particular quiet gifts that human connection provides when it arrives at the right moment for the right person. Now, there are things I have not told you about the people in this story who were unkind, and I want to tell you some of them now because a story that only has kindness in it is not true to the shape of life, and I have committed to truth. When it became known in certain circles, which is to say in the circles that Daniel Whitmore occupied professionally and socially, that he was spending his Saturdays in a small house on Carver Street in a modest city in North Carolina, there were reactions. I heard about these reactions at second hand, mostly from Daniel himself, who told me about them with a combination of rueful honesty and barely contained contempt for the people expressing them. and partly from a conversation I had with a woman whose name I will not use and whose role in Daniel's professional life I will describe only as significant, and whose relationship to Daniel I understood. From the way he sometimes mentioned her name with the careful neutrality of someone managing something rather than resolving it, as complicated. This woman called me. She found my number, which is not listed, but which is not impossible to find if you have resources. And she called me on a Thursday afternoon when I was sitting at my desk in the community office on Carver Street, reviewing a report about housing rehabilitation options in the corridor. I answered because it was an unknown number, and unknown numbers sometimes needed to be answered. She said, "Is this Margaret Cole?" I said, "Yes." She said, "My name is Diane Ressler. I work with Daniel Whitmore. I believe you know him." I said, "Yes." She said, "I wanted to speak with you directly because I think there are some things you may not understand about Daniel's situation that would be useful for you to know." I said, "I am listening." What followed was 11 minutes of what I can only describe as very well executed condescension. It was not crude. Diane Ressler was not a crude person, and she had not succeeded in the circles she occupied by being crude. It was sophisticated. It was delivered in the language of concern. Concern for Daniel's well-being and concern for the integrity of his professional commitments and concern. She said, with what sounded like genuine delicacy, "For me, for my situation," which she described as understandable and sympathetic. Words that contained within them the complete picture of what she thought of me, and what she thought of my house and my street and my 9-year-old house dress. None of which she had seen, but all of which she had assembled from the data points available to a person with resources who wanted to understand someone quickly and efficiently. She said things like, "Daniel has a tendency to retreat into simpler environments when he is under stress," which she said as a clinical observation, and which meant something that I heard clearly without her having to say it plainly. She said things like, "He has a great deal of goodwill toward people who are less fortunate, and sometimes that goodwill can create complications that he doesn't fully anticipate." She said things like, "I would hate for either of you to be hurt by expectations that the situation doesn't support." I let her finish. All 11 minutes of it. I let her use every carefully chosen word and every thoughtfully deployed implication without interrupting. Because I was raised by Dorothy Cole, and Dorothy Cole taught me that the most important thing to understand about a person is what they reveal when they believe they are in control of the conversation. And Diane Ressler was revealing something very specific about what she thought I was, and what she thought Daniel was, and what she thought the world was made of, and who it was made for. When she finished, I said, "I appreciate you calling." She said, "Of course. I just wanted to make sure you had all the information." I said, "I have a question for you." She said, "Yes." I said, "In the time you have known Daniel, has anyone ever made him breakfast?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'm not sure I understand the question." I said, "It's a simple question. In all the years you've known him, has anyone in his life ever made him breakfast on an ordinary morning, not a formal thing, not a restaurant, just sat him down and put a plate in front of him and made breakfast. She said, "I don't see what that has to do with anything." I said, "I know. That's the answer to your question." I said goodbye. I hung up. I sat for a moment at my desk in the former laundromat office that smelled of industrial detergent, and I thought about Diane Ressler and what she had invested in the conversation she had just had, and what she would do with the fact that it had not landed the way she intended. I thought about what kind of life produces a person who believes that the most dangerous thing a capable woman of modest means can do is to be genuinely kind to a powerful man in a moment of real vulnerability. I thought about the specific transaction she had expected the kindness to be, what she had assumed was being exchanged, and what I was expected to want in return. And I thought about how completely, how absolutely, how almost pitifully she had misunderstood every element of what had happened on Carver Street. I have not heard from her since. I do not expect to. Daniel told me about her when I told him about the call. He was sitting at my kitchen table on the following Saturday, and I told him, and I watched his face go through several things and settle into something that was not quite anger and not quite embarrassment, but was the specific expression of a man who has recognized something about the world he occupies that he has been not quite seeing for a long time. He said, "I'm sorry she contacted you." I said, "Don't be. She taught me something." He said, "What?" I said, "She taught me that you have been living in a world where people like me are not supposed to exist in relationship to people like you except in very specific and transactional ways, and that your being on my porch was genuinely incomprehensible to her because it did not fit the map." She said, "And that is not a small thing to know about a person's life." He said, "It is not a small thing to know about my life." I said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I have been thinking for a long time that the world I occupy is more real than the world that exists outside it. I think I stopped believing that before January, somewhere in the year before. But meeting you," he said, "and sitting in your kitchen, and talking about cities and gardens and what makes things work, reminded me that the world outside what I occupy is not simpler. It is just different. And different is not the same as lesser, and I had let myself forget that in ways I am still accounting for. I said, the world outside is not simpler. It requires everything the world inside requires and also certain additional things that wealth does not provide." He said, "What things?" I said, "The ability to be sustained by what is actually there rather than by what you can arrange to be there. The ability to find the life in a place that has not been optimized. The ability to receive from another person without calculating the exchange." He was quiet. Then he said, "I would like to learn those things." I said, "They are learnable. They are not easy and they take time, and you have to be willing to look like a beginner." He said, "I am not afraid of looking like a beginner." I said, "I know. That is one of the things I know about you that matters. This is the story, all of it. The cold night and the warm kitchen and the 6 Saturdays and the newspaper and the letter and the conditions and the repaired porch and Dorothy Cole's deep well and Patricia's 3 women and Clarence at the table and Marcus, and the scholarship and Diane Ressler's 11 minutes and the garden waiting for spring. This is a story about what kindness is for, not what it gets you. what it is for. It is for the making real of the connection between people that all of our systems and all of our stratifications and all of our very efficient ways of sorting human beings into categories work very hard to prevent. It is for the remembering that the person on the porch is a person before they are anything else, before they are an opportunity or a risk or a category or an inconvenience. It is for the practice of being the kind of woman who puts a second plate on the table because there is someone in the house and it is mealtime, and that is simply what you do. Subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell. Leave your name and your city in the comments right now. Tell me what you think about this story. Tell me what you are carrying that is heavy. Tell me about the Dorothy Cole in your life, the deep well you come back to when things are dry, because I believe that everyone who is doing this kind of living has one, and I want to know about yours. This is a community. Communities are built from stories. Tell me yours. My name is Maggie Cole. I am on Carver Street. The garden is waiting. And I will see you next time. One more thing. I need to tell you one more thing because it happened last week, and I have been sitting with it since, and it belongs at the end of this story in the way that certain things belong at the end. Not as a conclusion, but as an opening, the way a good ending always points toward something still becoming rather than something finished. Last week, Vera got her contractor's license recognized in the city's registry. It took 4 months of paperwork and meetings and one conversation with a city council member that I had to prepare for with the thoroughness of a person who knows that preparation is 90% of outcome. But it happened. Vera is now on the approved contractor list for the Whitmore Group initiative, which means she has more work than she has had in 5 years, which means she has been able to hire 2 assistants, one of whom is her nephew, who is 22, and who was working the kind of jobs that have no path forward, and the other of whom is a woman from 3 streets over named Candace, who learned electrical work from the same person Vera learned it from and who has been trying to get her own credentials recognized for 7 years. Candace cried when Vera called her. Vera told me this without sentimentality, simply as information in the way that Vera reports most things. She said, she cried, I didn't know what to say, so I just told her to come in Monday at 8. I said, that was the right thing to say. Vera said, I don't know why it took this long. I said, because the systems were designed without the assumption that people like you and Candace were inside them. We are changing that assumption. It takes longer than it should. She said, will it stick? After the initiative is done, after the money moves on, will the changes stick? This is the question that I think about more than any other. It is the question that Clarence asks in different words at every board meeting. It is the question that is underneath every conversation about development and community and what lasts and what is taken when the project managers leave and the press releases are written and the next initiative begins somewhere else. I do not have a complete answer. I have an incomplete one, which is the only honest kind available. I said, some of it will stick because we are building it into structures that exist beyond the initiative. Vera's license is in the registry permanently. Candace's credentials are established. Those are facts that do not disappear when the funding cycle ends. The community board's legal authority is written into the city's development agreement in language that Clarence's cousin has reviewed. That does not disappear either. What sticks is what we put into things that are larger than the initiative itself, into laws and licenses and records, and the knowledge that lives in Vera's hands and Candace's hands, and the two young men they are training. What I cannot guarantee, I said, is that the next person who comes to this street will have the same intentions as Daniel. I cannot guarantee that. What I can do is make sure that by the time the next person comes, this street knows what it is worth and has the documentation and the authority to say so. Vera looked at me for a moment. She said, "That's the most honest answer anyone in your position has ever given me." I said, "Honesty is non-negotiable for me. It always has been." She said, "It shows." I walked home from that conversation in the early evening with the February cold coming in the way it does in this part of North Carolina, not dramatically but insistently. And I passed the repaired sidewalk and Clarence's house, where the light was on, and walked up to my level porch and stood for a moment before going in. The garden was dormant, covered in the mulch I had laid in November, but I could feel it under there, the specific aliveness of dormant things that are not gone but only waiting, conserving what they need, preparing for the season that will ask everything of them. I have been gardening for 15 years, and I know that the dormant months are not the absence of the garden. They are the garden gathering itself for what comes next. I thought about that as I stood on the level porch in the February cold. The gathering, the conservation of what is needed for the season that will ask everything. I thought about the 8 months of bus rides and cleaning service polo shirts and late nights with calculator apps on my phone. I thought about Dorothy Cole at 40 with 3 children and a domestic's wage, and a dignity so complete it was itself a message. I thought about what it means to be a person who gathers in the dormant months, who conserves and prepares and stays in the ground even when the ground is cold and nothing visible is happening. Because you know, from the deep knowledge of long practice, that the season is coming and you will be ready. I am ready. I do not say this with bravado, and I do not say it with the false certainty of someone who does not know what is coming. I say it with the specific readiness of a woman who has been building something in herself for 53 years. Through Dorothy Cole and Gerald leaving and the medical center, and the cleaning service polo shirt, and the SUVs on Carver Street and the letter, and the conditions and Vera's license and Patricia's notebook, and the conversation about what sticks. All of that building, all of that practice, all of those choices in the dark on cold mornings was the gathering, was the conservation, was the dormant season doing its invisible necessary work. The spring is coming. The garden will be extraordinary. Daniel is coming in May. Clarence has a meeting in 3 weeks that might change how this neighborhood accesses health care. Marcus has a scholarship. Patricia's 3 women are in my notebook, and I am looking. Candace starts on Monday. The door on my porch opens outward. I have always thought this was a design choice with a meaning, a porch door that swings out rather than in, that opens toward the street rather than toward the house. Every time I open it, I am moving toward something rather than retreating from it. Every time someone stands on the other side and knocks, What I push toward them is the possibility of a different direction than the one they were moving in before the knock. I opened it for Daniel. I do not know who will come next. I do not need to know. What I know is that the door is sound and the porch is level and the kettle is on the stove and I have enough tea for whoever arrives and I am not afraid of the wrong things. Subscribe to this channel right now if this story reached you. Hit the notification bell. Leave your name and your city in the comments below. Tell me who you opened a door for, or who opened one for you, or who you are thinking about right now who might need a door opened, and what is stopping you from opening it. Tell me about your Dorothy Cole. Tell me about your Carver Street. Tell me about the door you almost did not open and what came through it when you did. We are building something here together, and I need you in it. Every comment, every name, every city, every story is another thread in what we are making. And what we are making is the understanding that none of us is doing this alone, that the kindness we show each other in the cold, dark, ordinary moments is the thing that holds the world together at its most essential level. Beneath the headlines and the SUVs and the strategic realignments and the very efficient ways we have developed for sorting each other into categories and deciding who deserves the open door. Everyone deserves the open door. That is the lesson. That is the whole lesson. And it costs you something to practice it, and it is worth every bit of the cost. And the person you become in the practicing of it is the realest thing you will ever have. My name is Maggie Cole. I live on Carver Street in North Carolina. I opened a door at 11:40 on a Sunday night in January, and my life became larger than I had imagined it could be from the inside of it. I will see you in the next video. Stay close. The story is not finished.